Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today we'll be discussing the 1929 film, The Leatherneck, with my friend Gareth Bradwick, who writes the Popped newsletter. Gareth, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, really good to be here. Thanks.
So before we get into today's film, tell listeners a little bit about who you are and where they can find your work.
So my name's Gareth, and I, as you say, write the Popped newsletter. And it's really about movie history, movie culture, especially here in the UK. I'd probably say I come at it from a curious point of view. I've started it so I can do some learning myself, really, and hopefully people might learn something as well going along. But I'm really interested in the history behind films, or how they were made, and specifically what that meant at the time. So, for example, one of my first posts was about the Great Dictator, but it was actually about releasing a film about Hitler during World War II. So
Sure.
I'm taking that aspect of it and going with curiosity, I'd say.
Perfect. Well, history and film, I think you're in the right place here on our conversation today.
Definitely, yeah.
And speaking of history, before we get into The Leatherneck, I'd like to kind of update our place in history since the last film that we talked about last week. So last week was February 10th was the release date. And this week we're February 24th. So in that time, normally I touch on notable births and deaths, but there weren't really too many folks of note that I recognized that I was able to find. I did find on February 11th, the Kingdom of Italy and the Holy See signed a treaty officially creating the independent state of the Vatican City within the city of Rome, which I thought, obviously we're recording about a week and a half after the passing of Pope Francis here. By the time folks hear this, I'm assuming the conclave will probably be done, so we'll know who the new Pope is, but interesting that official state of the Vatican City is not even 100 years old. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I thought that was that's an ancient thing.
Yeah, me too. And then on a little bit darker side, February 14th of 29 was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago, which obviously has been portrayed in films numerous times since then. On February 18th, the winners of the first Academy Awards were announced. They were printed on the back page of the Academy's newsletter, so a lot different, obviously, than how they're announced today. And the actual awards wouldn't be handed out for another 3 months in the middle of May. And then the last thing of note, February 22nd, U.S. President Calvin Coolidge delivered a commencement address at George Washington University, which also kind of doubled as his farewell address to the nation as his presidency was coming to an end. And I think, if I remember some of the other research I've done, the inauguration was in March at that time. Nowadays, we hold it in January, which I always thought that the inauguration had always been in January. So interesting to see how things like that change over time.
Yeah.
Any historical notes you had down?
Not particularly. So, but I think it's just an interesting time. I think what this film generally really highlights the time of 1929 in terms of the transition to sound.
Yeah.
We'll get onto that in a bit later, but I think it's really evident in this film where we are.
Yeah, for sure.
In terms of sound transition.
Yep. Well, let's move on to the film. So as I mentioned, The Leatherneck first appeared in theaters on February 24th, 1929. It was directed by Howard Higgin and written by Elliot J. Clausen and John W. Kraft.
It stars William Boyd as Private William Tex Calhoun, Alan Hale as Private Otto Fuzzy Schmidt, and Robert Armstrong as Private Joseph Birdie Hanlon, as well Fred Kohler as Captain Heckler, and Diane Ellis as Tanya. The film has a running time of 65 minutes, and it was distributed by Pathé Exchange.
And Clausen was the only nomination for the film, earning a nomination for Best Writing at the Second Academy Awards, one of his, I think, 3 or 4, if I remember correctly, in that category. And there are several versions of the film you can find on YouTube, although the ones that I was able to find are truly silent. There was no musical score. There's no dialogue, which from my research, it sounds like there was when the film was originally released. So interesting that it only survives in a pure silent version.
Yeah, I found a couple of clips where they'd found a reel 2 and reel 5 with sound. But apart from that.
Yep. So we'll jump right into the story here. So the setting is in China, at a marine base in China in the 1920s. There's 3 Marines that have deserted the base. Tex, Fuzzy, and Buddy. I'll just call them by their nicknames because that's probably the easiest way to note them. So they've deserted, and the guys in charge are trying to figure out where they are, and then they find them they've stumbled back in from somewhere, we don't know where yet, Buddy is dead, Tex is put on trial for his murder, and Fuzzy is kind of insane. He's just completely out of it. So we need to learn what happened with these guys, and how they got to this position.
Yeah, and I think at the start, it's some of the humor is already coming through. I think they call the chief the head growl or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's a guy called Jules Cowell who plays one of the officers, and he appears in a few times throughout the film as different characters. I think he's the cook later on.
Hmm.
But yeah, he's got a humorous way back to him. I couldn't quite get where we were in terms of the whether it was setting us up for a lighter
Yeah.
war film or what at this
Yeah,
stage.
I had some notes on that too. Whether it definitely had some elements of slapstick, even as we go on and get
Mm,
some of the backstory. But everywhere that I looked it up, it's listed as a drama. Nowhere was I really anywhere able to find it listed as a comedy. So I think it's technically supposed to be more serious, but with some funny moments in there, I guess.
yeah, I think without the sound, you're not sure where to play it.
Yeah,
I actually put on Hans Zimmer soundtrack just so I could have this. So I watched it the second time I put that on, and it just changed the vibe.
sure. Yeah, Hans Zimmer can change any film, I think. So we get Tex is on trial. He's in a court martial for the murder of his friend Buddy, and they use that as kind of a framing device for the rest of the main part of the story. So we get to see how he and Fuzzy first meet. Fuzzy's a German prisoner at the end of World War I, and for some reason that I never really quite understood, Tex decides to let him out of his barbed wire area and take him to the bar for a drink. Why not? It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, yeah, they just seem to get on, you know.
Yeah, and, so they end up in a fight, obviously, the other soldiers don't like there being German at the bar, they end up in a fight, and that's where they end up meeting Buddy as well, so they kinda start, palling
Yeah,
around together after that whole sequence.
the bit I liked that they tied a rope to him to
Yeah,
see like make sure you don't get away,
yeah.
and then they untie that rope and tie it onto someone else. But I you can't imagine that happening today.
I think that was the part where I wrote down, "Is this a comedy or what are we doing here?"
Yeah, yeah, nice setup.
Yeah.
Yeah, but even that whole night on the town thing felt comedic. It felt like a bit from Chaplin, you know.
Yeah, it was definitely trying to have some light moments, and obviously it takes a little bit more of a serious turn, towards the middle of the
Mm,
film.
yeah,
So, and maybe they were trying to keep it as light as possible in that first 2 reels or so,
yeah,
before getting into the more serious stuff later on.
yeah, yeah, drawing you in.
Yeah, exactly. So we get some time passes and we find out that Fuzzy has moved to the US and enlisted in the American military. And then the three of them are reunited in Vladivostok in Siberia, I guess. And where it seems like Fuzzy is kind of being deployed there with a group of other troops, and they run into him as he gets off the boat. They meet this Russian family there that's living off a mine in Manchuria, as well as the Captain Hekla that you mentioned at the beginning, who's some sort of kind of foreign interest, and he wants to take over the mine. I wasn't sure if he was, he's listed as Captain Hekla. He's called Captain Hekla. Not sure if he was a someone in the military or a former military, or if he was just a businessman who I'm going to be called Captain, and that's what everybody's going to call me.
Yeah,
But he obviously wants to get his hands on, this mine, take it out from under this poor family that's scraping by the skin of their teeth, with whatever they can make off of this mine.
and like you say, this is where it starts to get a little bit more serious. There's that whole bit. There's like a party going on, and that's where we meet the family, like Tanya and Tanya's brother and
Yeah.
things like that. And even that, there's some comedic moments about the one particular bit I really like. There's Tanya's brothers in the middle, and there's two people either side just boasting about their war efforts.
Yeah.
And one of them's like, "Oh, I captured 2,000 soldiers alone. I surrounded them." And then the brother's like, "Really?" So, but yeah, we're still sort of building up a bit of a light-hearted thing, but we're about to get more serious and the bad guy introduced properly.
Yes. Yep. And Hecla is obviously the bad guy. It's pretty clear from the moment he's introduced that he's up to no good. I felt a little bit like, I'm drawing a blank on it now. The bad guy from the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons, with the
Mm.
mustache and the
Oh
black hat.
yeah, yeah,
He it kind of, other than the fact that this guy had a white hat, he kind of reminded me of that character.
yeah. And the guy who plays him, Fred Kohler, I think he was a bad guy in a lot of his films.
Yep.
He sort of. So I wonder if that's just maybe the cartoon got it from him. You know.
Yeah, yeah, that's possible. I know, I'd seen also that he did a lot of, villain roles, a lot of, Western. I could definitely see him as a Western, kinda,
Yeah.
bad guy. And actually,
Yeah.
we'll see him again. I'm not sure if he's got a more prominent role in the movie Thunderbolt, which is coming up in a few weeks, a little over a month on the podcast, but, we will see him at least one more time in one of these films for the second Academy Awards.
Oh, nice.
So we get Fuzzy and Buddy end up, or I'm sorry, the all three of them, the trio of guys, kind of discovers that Heckle has a plot to take over the mine from this family, and they end up, I guess, kind of beating him up. And then Tex ends up marrying Tanya, the daughter of the Russian father there. And I had a question in that wedding scene. The officiant, the priest of this wedding, obviously they're in Siberia in Russia, and he looked very much like the why am I drawing a blank on this guy's name too? Rasputin. Very much like a
Yeah.
Rasputin type character.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was supposed to be or if it was just kind of doing
Just
that
a
because it's
coincidence.
a similar so something that people would be familiar with at that time.
Yeah. I was just taken by what Tanya was wearing. She looked like Queen Amidala from Phantom Menace. She had
Yes.
like a big bridal thing. Yeah. So I was,
Yes. You're absolutely right.
yeah,
I hadn't even thought about that, but now that you mention it, I can totally see that inspiration there. I'll have to go back and watch that scene again now and
yeah, you have
compare
to.
them
Yeah.
side by
Yeah.
side.
Yeah. I watched it twice, and both times I was like, whoa, there
Yeah,
she is again.
for sure.
There's a bit just before that as well where they are Tex and Tanya are in the woods and they're about to kiss or something, and then the brother just jumps out of a tree.
Yeah.
He just seems to jump from so high out of nowhere, and he's just like, "Do you two love each other?" And I laughed out loud. It was so bizarre.
Yeah, yeah, there was several moments like that that seemed just very out of place. Like they didn't tie to anything else. But yeah, that one was definitely a moment that kind of had me cocking my head to the side
Like,
there for a moment. So after the that whole sequence, we I guess jump forward. No, I'm sorry. Before we get to that, so the eventually Hecla does manage to mount some revenge, and he ends up killing a bunch of the people in this town, including Tanya's father and the brother, in a scene that's in many places I saw people calling this the best scene in the entire film. They have it's shot with instead of actually showing these people getting killed, they're just shadows against a wall cut against the machine gun that's gunning them down. And I happen to agree. It was to say that scene of people getting shot and killed is my favorite scene, but it is not the right way to say it. But I think it's the most artistic scene of this film
yeah.
by far.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I thought, right, this is it. We're in now. This is the meat of the story. But yeah, absolutely. It was quite scary to watch them all fall down, and I felt for the main characters at that point.
Yeah.
So I didn't think, are they going to be the ones? And because they're shadows, you're not quite sure. Did they get them properly? But they do. Yeah, it's definitely the best part of the film.
Yeah, and then Hecla tricks Tanya into going away with him to look for the brother and the father. Obviously, she doesn't know that they've just been killed, and that's kind of his excuse to get her out of the way. And he takes her, I guess, off to the mine eventually to look for them. And it's not really clear whether she's kind of kept there as a hostage or something like that. But obviously, she never finds her brother and father, but we don't see her for a little while in the film itself. So then we cut forward a little bit in time to see Fuzzy and Buddy. They're stationed somewhere nearby still. This would be the probably the base in China. It seemed like that they were stationed at, which I understood to kind of be close to where this mine was. Again, it's all very vague in terms of how that all works, but they see a news article that Hecla has taken over the mine. And I think first it's Buddy decides to go out and investigate or no, I've got my, I'm not sure
Oh
not sure
yeah, there's
who.
a bit of a like, yeah, right in 2 weeks if you haven't heard back from me, and then there's another one, and
Right.
then
Yeah.
yeah,
One of the two of them goes first to check everything out, and he says, "Come find me in 2 weeks if you haven't heard." And obviously hasn't heard anything, so the other one goes out to find out what's going on. And then Tex ends, he's wondering where his buddies are because they don't say anything to him because obviously they don't want to alarm him about anything. So he kind of hears from, I think it's that same character, the cook that you mentioned earlier, who's kind of the comic relief. that he's like, "Oh, this note, I'm supposed to give you this note in 2 weeks if he's not back." And, of course, Tex opens it up right away. He's like, "Oh, no, you can't open it yet. It hasn't been 2 weeks." So that was another point where I did kinda laugh out loud at the hilarity of that.
Yeah, and I think like you say about the locations, I think I was a bit confused about where we were at any given points as well. They did show some, like, exterior shots, but because of the quality of the image, I was like, where are we? We're in
Yeah.
Russia now? So it lost me a bit, yeah, at certain points.
Yeah, and you mentioned those exterior shots. I wrote down because we get a few of those at the beginning when they're before we enter the flashback where they're kind of staggering back through the desert back to the base, and I thought some of those initial shots towards the beginning were fabulous.
Yeah,
I'm assuming they were probably shot in the deserts outside of Los Angeles and not actually in Manchuria or wherever they're supposed to be. But I wish we'd gotten more of that in this
yeah,
story.
yeah, I did look at into reviews later, but one of the reviews I saw mentioned how well the exterior stuff, how much effort they put into all the locations and things like that.
Yeah. So as we said, Tex ends up learning where the guys are. So he then decides to go out and try and track them down. And he manages to make it to the mine, and he finds that Hecla is already dead, and Buddy is almost dead. He's obviously had some sort of shootout with Hecla, and that's where he received his gunshot wound that eventually kills him as they're heading back to the base. And then we also see that Fuzzy is nearby. He's strung up on some sort of torture rack, kind of with water dripping on him slowly, and that's kind of what's caused him to lose his mind, go insane, as we saw at the beginning of the film. So they head back to the base. There's a scene, a very touching scene, I thought, where Buddy dies in Tex's arms while they're on a boat on the way back. And then we're back in the present day where we started back at the trial, where as you said, Tex is on trial for Buddy's murder because nobody but he was it's believed that he killed his friend while they were out in the desert, and also he's on trial, I guess, for desertion as well. So we get a moment, and this is another point where the continuity kind of completely just goes off the rails. We see while the trial they're about to wrap up the trial and find him guilty of both counts. Fuzzy's in the nearby room, and he just happens to see Tanya out in the street, who just happens to be walking by
Convenient,
this base. All very convenient, and he's able to snap out of his daze, his insanity, long enough to call out to her, bring her in so she can vouch for Tex and corroborate the story that he's just told throughout the film. And then ultimately, he's not found guilty for Buddy's murder based on her testimony, but he is still found guilty of desertion, for which his punishment is confinement of 1 whole hour. And that's in
all's
a
well that ends
nutshell.
well.
That is the Leatherneck.
Yeah.
You miss anything?
I don't think so, yeah. I mean, it's only just over an hour, but I think it was like 55 minutes on YouTube.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
That's versions there are much
s
shorter.
yeah, and then some of the bits, like that bit at the end when he's recognizing her, seem to drag on for a while, even though it's quite a tight time frame. But yeah, I think you got it.
Well, a lot of the folks that were involved in making this, I've already talked about on the podcast, but obviously haven't talked about them with you. Director Howard Higgin and writer Elliot Clausen, as well as William Boyd and Alan Hale, were all involved in Skyscraper, one of the first films I covered on this season of the podcast. They also worked together on Sale of Singapore, which was also nominated for Best Writing, but sadly is not readily available. So we've touched on all those guys quite a bit. Anything you want to add on any of those four?
Well, I had a brief look at them. I mean, in terms of writer, didn't you get it nominated for a few things that year, from what I
Yep, it
read?
was so Skyscraper, Sale of
Yeah,
Singapore, this film, and I think one more. I can't I'm trying to find my screen here where I've got the Academy Award stuff pulled up. Yep. Oh, the other one was The Cop, which is also not it's said to exist, but it's not available on YouTube anywhere. So my thing with these is that I feel like it's that heyday of the early studio system where they're just cranking these get 4 or 5 guys together that really work well together, and you're just cranking these out every 2 or 3 months.
yeah. And I think from what I've read in terms of the amount of effort, there were three technical advisors. There was a US Marine officer, former captain of the Russian Imperial Guards, and a Chinese linguist. So it sounds like they were trying to head towards authenticity.
Yeah.
And we'll get to the critique later, but I kind of feel like the whole thing is heading towards something good. But like you say, it's probably just part of this big machine where they're trying to churn out these things.
Yeah.
So yeah, apart from that, that's what I have.
I completely agree that there's a kernel of an idea there. I think if it's just not seen through to its potential by any stretch.
Yeah. And it's interesting that they've got obviously both they had to release it in sound and in silent versions.
Hmm.
And uh, I likened it. I'm a bit of a gaming nerd as well, so I likened it because you've got this generation of consoles and you've got the PS4, and they're still trying to make for both sides, and then you lose quality overall.
Right.
But I kind of feel like that's this is a product of its time in a way where they're trying to please both. They're trying to attract this new phone era, but also they know that most of the cinemas right now are just installing all that equipment. So I kind of feel like they were distracted a little bit.
Yeah, it's definitely a snapshot of that crossover period where, it's not, obviously there's intertitles throughout, so it's not entirely reliant on the sound. And I would imagine even with the sound that they kept a lot of those in, but I don't know that for sure. Obviously not seeing a full sound version of it, but
Yeah. From what I've seen, I think that I watched a bit of the one on YouTube that's real too, and the sound was only in the courtroom scenes, and then the rest was still silent.
okay.
But then some of the reviews I read were saying the sound throughout the shotgun shooting and things like that. So either they hadn't seen the film when they sent that review out, or the version I've seen isn't quite the full thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me, watching these roughly in order of when they were released. So the last film last week, Weary River, was also probably in a similar fashion, part sound, part dialogue, part just synchronized score, and I thought that generally worked better than this. Obviously, I didn't get the full effect in this one, but I think and one of my things that I think I mentioned on that episode was I wish they had done almost like a Wizard of Oz type thing where it's sound at the beginning and the end,
Mhm.
and as a framing device. And I think if you're saying that it was just for the courtroom scenes, I feel like that might have made it a little bit more effective. That he's that's the current the present day, and then everything that's the flashback is in silent. I think that would be a little bit more make sense.
Yeah, that would yeah, that's true. Yeah, I was going to say that. Have you seen a pattern of a difference in quality among this batch?
Yeah, and I've been seeing it throughout these episodes. A lot of it. Generally speaking, the quality of films, the nominees from this second Academy Awards, is lower than what I saw for the first Academy Awards. I haven't really landed on why. It might be just that we were more in that transition period between silent and sound than we were with the first. Everything at the first Academy Awards was silent, with the exception of those few lines from the jazz singer. Here, it's much more of a mix between both, especially as we get into early 1929 and as we go on. I think most of the rest of the films that I'm covering this time around are at least partial, if not fully, sound from this point forward.
Yeah, I mean, I did a piece on the development of sound in film, but and it's well documented in on film how what a nightmare this period was in terms of you've got two types of sound you can pick from. You've got the mics that aren't have to be hidden in bushes and things like that. So it must have been a huge distraction for the quality of the film when they've got all these things to think about that are new, but also trying to create something artistic. It must have been a challenge to say least.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, you look at some of the ones from the 1925, 26, 27 from that period. I mean, they were doing some. They'd really started to finally figure out the language of film. I think in the early to mid 20s, and then they have to just go back to square one as soon as they introduce sound, and everything kind of resets. So takes them another 5, 10 years at least to really kind of find their footing again. I think.
Yeah, yeah. It's a new art form, I suppose. You can sort of see why people like Chaplin stuck with silent because they knew it.
Yeah.
You know, you can see
Yep.
why
Still
they did
works.
that. Yeah.
And I forget who the actress was. I don't think I mentioned it on the episode a couple of weeks back, but one of the bits of research I'd done, one of the actresses kind of lamented the fact that silence just died off so quickly. She felt like there was still a place for them, And obviously, we can see even nowadays, sometimes it's a little bit more of a gag or something like that, but we do still see an occasional film with just music or just music and sound effects where there's no dialogue. I see it a lot in animation, sometimes in shorts, or even
Yeah.
in like Flow that won the Academy Award this
Yeah.
year was
Yeah.
essentially a silent film other than the music.
There's an episode of the first season of Only Murders in the Building, and they did a completely silent episode as well.
Yeah.
So, it still works,
Yeah.
but like you say, it's its own form, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, it still works as long as you have a good story to use it for.
Yeah.
So obviously we talked about kind of the leads. The other two folks that we haven't talked about yet are the actor Robert Armstrong who played Buddy. He was most notable for his role as the filmmaker Carl Denham in the King Kong movie in 1933, and continued to work well into the 50s, even a couple roles in the 60s. So he was very prolific. We mentioned Fred Kohler as Captain Heckla. And then the other one that's a little bit sad is Diane Ellis as Tanya. She only
Yeah.
appeared in 10 films and actually passed away just shy of her 21st birthday in 1930. So not long after this film was released.
Yeah, like a year later, wasn't it? I think it was in India.
Yep. Yeah. On our
She
honeymoon,
got an
actually.
infection. Yeah,
Yeah.
so sad. But apparently, her film in the 1930 was a really good one. Like, made it set her on the path to be quite a star, I think.
Yeah. I feel like it would have been one of those. I'm trying to think of Heath Ledger was a little bit older when he passed, but something similar to
Mm,
that, where he's definitely turning into a rising
yeah,
star.
like a shock.
Anything else about any of the folks involved that you want to touch on?
Not really. I mentioned about Fred Kohler obviously playing villains, and you mentioned about Tanya, Diane that I wanted to bring up. But no, like you say, very prolific. A lot of these people at the time was going through them, and then obviously Billy Boyd turning into the Western star that he was.
Yes.
But he was, I thought he was a standout in this particular film out of all of them. He carried a lot of the dramatic scenes, I think,
Yeah,
just
definitely.
in
He
terms of
was.
the way he looked.
Yeah, he was definitely the star. And I think I couldn't help but compare this to Skyscraper being the other one that I saw with all of these folks, and I think he was definitely the main draw for both of these films, and for probably a lot of these films that this whole crew made together. I'm sure his name was top of the marquee whenever they put these in the theaters.
Yeah, definitely.
Obviously, we talked through the story. It's relatively simple story when you get right down to it, and I couldn't help but thinking throughout anytime they cut back to the court martial scenes was, well, it's not a few good men, which is obviously probably the benchmark for military court dramas, but
Yeah.
interesting to see that they were using that device of a courtroom drama even back then.
Yeah, I think it was a good framing device to go for. They didn't go back to it. They didn't make enough of it, I don't think. It was just a way for them to move the story on. And I was thinking a year later after this, All Quiet on the Western Front came out, and the difference then in what the story they're telling, the scope is unbelievable, really, if you compare it, if you think of it like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, if my memory serves, in one of the historical notes from a couple episodes back was that the novel of All Quiet on the Western Front had just been published not too long before this. So
Ah,
obviously that one's coming, and it amazes me too, just between the first and second Academy Awards here, how many the First World War and the Russian Revolution kept coming up over and over again, and we're about 10 to 15 years removed, depending on where in
yeah.
those events you see. But it's interesting that those kept coming up as main topics in these films.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, I'm trying to think of when all the Iraq War films were coming out. How long after the event? Is it American Sniper? But even Warfare, that's what are we, 15, 20 years after the event, and it still holds some sort of relevance today. So
Yeah.
I wonder if that's sort of a factor.
Yeah, and even thinking back to earlier, obviously the first Iraq War, Jarhead, I think
Yeah,
was
yeah,
about
yeah.
15 to
Hmm.
20 years after all of that happened. So it definitely holds our attention for a while. And going back a little bit further, you see in the 60s and 70s and early into the 80s, a lot of Vietnam War films, obviously.
Yeah.
So it,
I guess it's far enough. It's still in everyone's collective memory, but it's far enough away for you to have a little bit of distance emotionally from the terrors of the time, I suppose.
yeah, for sure. Well, you mentioned you'd seen a couple of reviews. Any of those you wanna, highlight especially?
Yeah, so I tried to look at the UK ones to see if there was anything in particular. There is a lot of talk about the realism being because of the incorporation of sound. And then there's the Kinematograph Weekly has it's supposed to be one of the really astounding box office sensations of the year, according to them. That's where I saw from the UK.
Yeah, I actually wasn't able to find as much on this in terms of contemporary reviews. The ones that I, was really able to find were more modern takes on it.
Yeah. Hmm.
I did try and find one blog, Sin Eater, that's Cineater blog, called it an entertaining light adventure film, though it works better as a buddy picture than it does as an expose of life in the core. Found a letterbox review that said it was a solid little action movie that never flags thanks to its brief sub-hour running time. And then this was my favorite one. It looked like a user review on Rotten Tomatoes. This movie has no plausibility with an exclamation mark. It also has terrible editing and zero chemistry. So
Wow.
she was not a fan of it.
She went in.
Yeah, and wanted to make sure everybody knew that. But yeah, I'm somewhere in the middle of all those three, I think, if I'm
Mm,
being honest.
yeah.
We'll get to our final thoughts in a minute.
I found on archive.org motion picture news
Mhm.
from the time, and it says Pate has wisely steered away from the path of propaganda and has given the fans powerful entertainment in sound, dialogue, and effect. Direction is restrained and intelligent, as is also the acting. The music score by Zero leaves nothing to be desired, not that we know. Dialogue is sensibly and effectively spoken. Synchronization is satisfactory. The exteriors, particularly in France and the Far East, are authentically portrayed. William Boyd, Alan Hale, Robert Armstrong were never better, and Diane Ellis, a blonde beauty, should go far as a leading lady. So that's interesting.
Yep, that's definitely very very full of praise there, and I think it comes back to what we talked about at the beginning. It's so hard to judge this watching it as watching it without the dialogue, watching it without the music and the
Mhm,
sound effects.
mhm.
It's so hard to really judge it honestly because we're missing a third at least of the what makes the movie effective.
I completely agree. And by the sounds of it, from the contemporary reviews, a lot of the popularity was in the music and in the dialogue itself and the wonder of that at the time.
Yeah.
And I am sure that dragged along some of the points that we didn't find particularly good. But yeah, I mean, I tried with my soundtrack, but if I had a bit of time, I might have mixed them so they fitted well. But maybe next time.
Yeah. Well, obviously, we mentioned at the top, Leatherneck was nominated for Best Writing at the Second Academy Awards, one of the four for which he was nominated. And unfortunately, he did not win for any of them. I think the award went to The Patriot, which I believe, if I remember back to my preview episode from this season, is the only Oscar winner that is no longer available or considered a lost film. So, you want to give some ratings and some final thoughts on the film?
Rating. Do what do you do? Do you do rating out of 10 out of
Yep,
5?
I do out of 10 usually.
Okay. I think I'll give this a 6 out of 10. I enjoyed it for what it was. I think that it was generally lighter in tone than some of the war films, like I mentioned, All Quiet on the Western Front that's coming. It tried to strike a little bit of a lighter tone, a little bit less anti-war or even having an opinion on war, really. I liked the fact that it was sort of dealing with the post-traumatic side that comes along with war, but there were some bizarre moments like the brother jumping out the tree, and I didn't quite know where I stood sometimes in terms of the tone it was going for. And to say I watched it twice and I enjoyed it both times, gives it a 6, but I think the flaws were partly due to the lack of sound maybe. So yeah, 6 out of 10, I'd say.
All right. You're a little bit more generous than I'm gonna go with a 4 out of 10, which is also what I gave to Skyscraper. So I guess I'm not a huge Higgin Boyd Hale fan when it comes right down to it. I agree that we're missing something without the sound, without the music. But I think for me, the kind of confusing parts of the story were a little bit too much of a detractor. Again, I mentioned earlier I really liked some of those exterior scenes, when they're coming home through the desert, even some of the city scenes that we get that the one review mentioned. I enjoyed that, but not enough to kind of counteract some of the moments where I just kind of tilted my head and said, "Really? That's what they're going to
Right.
go with for to make this story make sense?" So, yeah, I went with a 4 out of 10 for this one, and might be able to bump it up to a 5 if I rewatched it at some point. But I guess I'm a little bit less high on it than you are.
Yeah, I think I'd probably come down to a 5. If we did meet in the middle, I'm happy. This is good 5 as well.
Fantastic. Well, I will include a list of resources in the show notes to any of the reviews and articles and stuff that we mentioned throughout the episode, as well as where you can watch the Leatherneck for yourself. So, Garrett, thank you again for coming on the show and talking about the Leatherneck. Remind people once more where they can find your work.
No, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I've really enjoyed watching it. So yeah, it's popped on Substack, so pop.substack.com, and I occasionally do YouTube as well. So go and search Popped on YouTube. You might find a few things there as well.
And don't forget to follow the Oscar Project at theoscarproject.substack.com. And be sure to come back for next Friday's episode of the podcast where I will be discussing the film The Divine Lady. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at the movies.